title, what if we could rehabilitate sex offenders? And this is a title to fit in with our Wednesday What If series. It doesn't necessarily mean that we can or we can't. I'm just posing the question, what if we could? And what would we need to know to be able to say with a degree of confidence that we can or we cannot rehabilitate sex offenders? So those are the issues that we'll be covering today. Right, so I'm supposed to say something about myself, Randolph Grace, or Randy Grace, and I'm in the psychology department, and I've taught here since 1998, and if you're interested in learning more about the research with sex offenders at Kiamarma, or the research that I'm going to be discussing, send me an email, and I'll be happy to send you any of the articles that I will be talking about. And you can, Google Scholar is quite a nice resource. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it, but I actually think it's better. I use it myself a lot rather than the proprietary databases that we pay a lot of money for here. It's really good. But if you type my name as in the author field, you'll get all of the articles and so forth, and so you can look them up if you like. In any case, I don't like to talk about myself, so let's skip that and let's get to the topic, sexual offending. Right, so everybody knows sexual offending is a major problem for society. And that's true even though sexual crimes are always a very small proportion of the total recorded offenses. But the difficulty, of course, is that they can cause harm to the victims that lasts for their entire life. And sexual crimes, they may be a small proportion of the total offenses that get reported, but more than any other type of crime, perhaps, sexual offenses tend to be underreported. And so they're difficult to report, difficult to prosecute, and just pretty much difficult all around. And so it's because of the harm that they cause, and society needs to have some kind of response. We need to do something collectively as a society to mitigate this type of for today's talk, what if we could rehabilitate sex offenders? In New Zealand, it's been reported by the Department of Corrections that 20% of prisoners, of incarcerated offenders in New Zealand are incarcerated for sex crimes. So that seems very high, actually, but those are the data from the Department of Corrections. Right, okay, so if we think about sex offenders in the public sphere, or how they're portrayed, or how they appear in the media, I just did a quick Google Images search and looking for different images of sex offenders. And the lower left-hand corner, that's from Fox News in the United States, which is quite a sensationalistic sort of media source. Sex offender visits school. There's always some big alert when a sex offender gets released. And then other times you'll see notices that are posted up in towns or cities. He's handsome, witty, charming, friendly, and a child molester. And there are a lot of creepy-looking guys. So that I think that the sex offender, the idea of sex offender, it just resonates. It has a big, really a big presence within our media. And in New Zealand, the most recent one that I was able to find just a couple of weeks ago, principal of a school in the North Island was recently denied parole. So, of course, sexual offending is a big deal here, and it's dealt with quite seriously. Okay, so back to our topic. What if we could rehabilitate sex offenders? I'm basically going to be asking, what do we know? What do we know from research about sexual offenders that will allow us to answer that question of whether we can or cannot rehabilitate them? And by the way, I should say, by rehabilitation, what I mean is that we will prevent them from reoffending, and specifically prevent them from sexually reoffending. If they get a DUI or like a burglary or a drug offense, yeah, we don't want that, but that's not the real issue. The most important thing is to prevent them from reoffending. Rehabilitation itself is sort of, you could think of it in broader terms, that maybe they turn their life around and they lead a fulfilling life rather than the life of crime. But that's not what I'm really concerned with here. It's just simply right at the coalface. We want to prevent them from reoffending. And the sex offenders that I'll be talking about primarily, the sex offenders in New Zealand, are child molesters. So I'm not going to be talking about rapists. It's totally talking about child molesters. So, but first I want to consider whether the results from research really accord with the perception of the public, which of course can be shaped by media and what you mean, movies or perhaps items that you've read in the newspaper. There was a recent study by some researchers in Florida where they put questions about sexual offenders' risk of reoffending and the effectiveness of treatment to a bunch of people in the community. So basically non-offenders, just sort of ordinary people, as well as a sample of sex offenders who were in prison and had been convicted of sex crimes. And they basically wanted to look at how accurate the responses of these two groups, the community sample and the sex offenders, were regarding a number of questions relating to risk of reoffending and the effectiveness of treatment. So does the public have an accurate understanding is really, so that's the first thing that I'm going to be talking about. And I'll just pause here for a moment and just give you an outline of what I'll be covering in this hour. Talk about the public perception of sex offenders, and then give you a little bit of an introduction to risk assessment. This is important because we've got to be able to identify which offenders are more likely to reoffend and give them, more intensive treatment or more, monitor them more closely after they're released from prison. Then I'll talk about the Kiamatama program, which is a special treatment unit for sexual offenders, child molesters at Randolph Prison. It's been going since 1989, and most of the research that I'll be sharing with you is based at KM. And I'll talk about 5 specific research studies, just to sort of give you a sense of the scope of work that's being done here. Right, okay. Public perception of sex offenders. Right, probably you guys have seen CSI or shows like Law and Order Special Victims Unit. They always have, I mean, these aren't real, they're not real stories, it's all drama. But these television crime dramas, I think, really do have a significant effect on our perceptions of what sex offenders really are. And so there was another thing that I found. This is in the United States. There's a website called www.bustedoffenders.com. And if you go to this website, you have this nice, find sex offenders in your neighborhood. Be informed of your surroundings and keep your family safe. So you can literally just type in your street address and up will pop a Google Maps with, if there are registered sex offenders that have domiciles within that area, they will come up. And of course, what the website's trying to do is get you to upgrade your membership to receive monthly reports on sex offenders near your home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a commercial outfit. But I should say, in New Zealand, we do not have the same law. So in the United States, sex offenders have to register where they're going to live. Even after they've been released from prison, they've fulfilled all of their conditions of parole. They still are being monitored, and they have to register. And that's public information, which is why you can get a website like this. So a little later on, we'll consider whether this type of response by society, is this helpful or not? I don't know. But we have some research which might be relevant. Okay. So back to these were the actual questions that were posed by the researchers in Florida. And so here's the first one. What percentage of convicted sexual offenders do you believe will commit another sexual offense? How many people think it's more than 30%? More than 40%? More than 80%? Well, The average response of the community sample in the Florida study was 74%. So 74%, the community sample said, on average, 74% of convicted sex offenders will commit another offense, another sexual offense. Now, when they put the same question to the sex offenders themselves, the sex offenders said 21%. So it's quite a big discrepancy. The actual data, now this is a little bit hard to come by because we're combining across a lot of different jurisdictions and studies, but the best single estimate, 14%. So 14% of convicted sex offenders will commit another sexual offense. Now, the percentage that will commit any type of offense is higher. Could be 30% or 40% or higher. But sexual offense, sexual recidivism overall is 14%. And that doesn't mean that for some offenders, that some offenders might be particularly dangerous and have effectively a higher likelihood of reoffending than that. So risk assessment is all about trying to figure out which ones are the high-risk cases and which ones are the low-risk cases. Okay, what percent of rapists do you believe will reoffend in a sexual manner? So the results here were similar. The public said 74%. Sex offenders said 34% they think rapists are a little bit worse. The data, 20%, they are a little bit worse. But not, it's still lower than what the sex offenders said. What percent of child molesters do you believe will reoffend in a sexual manner? Public, 76%. Sex offenders, 27%. And the data, 13%. This is a very interesting question. What percent of adult sexual offenders do you believe were sexually abused as children? Public, 67%. Sex offenders themselves, 54%. So they believe more than half of them were sexually abused. But the data, of course, again, this is difficult, but the best data that we have, it's 28%. So being sexually abused as a child it's not basically a guarantee that when that child grows up that he or she is going to be a sexual abuser. Now, Fortney et al. Also asked about beliefs regarding the effectiveness of treatment. And so the question was sex offenders who received, or the statement, the sex offenders who receive specialized psychological treatment will commit another sexual offense. This statement is, and then you had to say whether it's completely false, somewhat neutral, somewhat true, or completely true. And the thing to note here is that the offenders, their most likely response, their modal response, was to say that that statement was completely false. Whereas the community sample, their modal response was to say that it was somewhat true. So the public is skeptical about the effectiveness of treatment, perhaps justifiably so. The offenders themselves are saying, that's a false statement. No, treatment, of course, it makes sense that they would have that belief. And I think we would want them to have that belief. I mean, if we really want them not to reoffend, we want them to believe that when they're treated, that they're cured. Fortney's results really highlight many of the public's, I'm going to say misperceptions about sex offenders. Not that the public is wrong, or that, but just that there is really a discrepancy between how sexual offenders are portrayed in the media and the kind of the sort of the zeitgeist and what research tells us. And so one of the purposes of my giving this talk here is to kind of spread the word a little bit. These misperceptions really underscore the need for good research. And I'd say that really the three most important questions, and these are the ones that we'll be focusing on tonight, involve risk assessment. So we've got to know which of those offenders are most likely to reoffend, which are the really bad guys. Effective treatment. So we've got to be able to design and develop and deliver effective psychological treatments, behavioral treatments for sexual offending. And there's an important question here which is related to the ability to deliver effective treatment. If we can deliver effective treatment, we ought to be able to measure treatment change. That is, we ought to have some way of being able to identify which offenders have benefited from treatment or have shown more progress in treatment compared with other offenders. And then maybe the most important question, does psychological treatment work? Does it reduce the likelihood of sexual recidivism? Okay, before we get into before I get into telling you about risk assessment, I want to put a little context here for you, and that's just to tell you about what's been called the big drop in sex crimes. And basically these are data showing the per capita or the rates of sexual assault and forcible rape in the United States for rape and sexual assault in Canada, basically from the 1980s up through 2007. And the point the authors are making is that starting around 1991, the early 90s, there was this general decline of maybe 30% in the rates of sexual crimes. So these are not rates of reoffending. These are just the crimes that get reported to police that get prosecuted. Correspondingly, around this same time, the reports of child sexual abuse cases declined about 40%. This is in the United States between 1992 and 2000. And the remarkable this is great. This is good news. We want to see those numbers going down. But the funny thing is, nobody really knows why. The rates of homicide and violent offenses and so forth have also been going down. And there have been a number of suggestions for why this is. Maybe it's just the shifting demographics. Maybe it's an increased, as sexual offending has become, it's sort of less taboo to talk about. Perhaps that makes it more likely to prosecute and to report. But if that was the case, then maybe we should see an increase rather than a decrease. But maybe we're actually seeing, because of that increased awareness, perhaps the rates are really going down. That if sexual offenders or persons that are that might commit a sexual offense, perhaps they're choosing not to, or they're because they know it's more likely that they're going to get prosecuted. Nobody really knows why, but this has been a trend that's been observed in overseas data. And the New Zealand data are a little bit sketchy, and this is something that we might try to look into, see if we can flesh this out. But the Statistics New Zealand website have some data on sexual offense rates, and this is over pretty much the same years, 1994 to 2000, and there's sort of a modest decline in sexual attacks, maybe 20%. Not quite as dramatic, perhaps, as in Canada and the United States, but certainly going in the right direction. So overall, there does seem to be a decrease in the rates of sexual offending. And I want to give you one more data point, just to sort of store in the back of your mind as we go through the talk, and that's the rates of sexual recidivism. So this is what we're really trying to stop. So we have a sexual offender who's gone to prison, and now they're getting released. And these data, we have the data from Department of Corrections for all of the offenders, sexual offenders, that were released in 1987. And over the next 10 years, so 10 years after release, 77 of them, or 27.6%, were convicted for a new sexual offense. So that's a recidivism rate of 27.6%. Okay, so now I'm going to move along and talk about risk assessment. Now, risk assessment, we've got to get some terminology down. A risk factor, we talk about a risk factor is just a variable that predicts reoffending. Usually it predicts an increased likelihood of reoffending. So for instance, the number of prior sexual convictions that an offender has. The more prior sexual convictions an offender has, the more likely it is statistically for him to commit another sexual offense after he gets released. Now that's just maybe a fancy way of saying the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And in fact, the best predictors of sexual offending in the future are basically behavior in the past. And these are known as static factors, and they relate to basically the offense history of the offender. So how many prior offenses he has. Does he have male victims? If he's got male victims, he's actually more likely to reoffend. Does he have stranger victims? Has he offended against a stranger? If he has, he's more likely to reoffend. So all of these have been shown in many previous studies to have a statistically significant relationship with the likelihood of future reoffending. And so we call them, these are called static factors, static risk factors, because they cannot change. They're the history of the offender. We know that they're the best predictors of reoffending, but they cannot change. So they can't be the whole story. If our goal is to be able to rehabilitate offenders, static factors are going to be useful for us because we can identify which offenders are high risk and which are low risk, but static factors by themselves will not tell us anything about progress that an offender may have made in treatment. Now, for that reason, a lot of research has looked at what are known as dynamic risk factors. So dynamic risk factors are variables that are predictive of reoffending, but at least in principle can be changed. And so, for instance, if an offender has attitudes towards offending which support offending, so for instance, if he believes that kids like to have sex with adults, that would be an example of a pro-offending attitude. Deviant arousal, if the offender is unable to have a heterosexual or homosexual relationship with an adult, but instead can only become sexually aroused with children. That would be considered deviant arousal. Maybe we can change that. Interpersonal competency is another very important one because many of these sex offenders, these are lonely people. They are not able to form meaningful relationships with adults, and so they identify emotionally with children. And so some of treatment needs to be to basically increase their ability to have a relationship, to work on their social skills. And finally, emotional regulation. Lots of times they suffer from anxiety and depression, or they have difficulty with anger. They've got all sorts of emotional problems. And these variables, again, they have been studied. Research has looked at them, and basically the more, if you have pro-offending attitudes or deviant arousal or poor social skills or difficulty controlling anger, all of these variables are significantly related to the likelihood of future offending. But in principle, they might be changed. So they're going to be very important for us because we want to be able to measure whether or not offenders have made gains on these dynamic risk factors. And so we're going to conceptualize treatment gain as change in dynamic risk. So what we usually do when we talk about risk assessment is we want to be able to predict. We want to be able to predict, what's the likelihood that an offender is going to reoffend. And this is quite common. It's in the field of psychology, we want to be able to predict whether or not offenders are going to reoffend, but other fields such as medicine and so forth, they really face similar challenges. You have to predict whether or not a patient is going to survive treatment. And in all of these areas, we can think about them as applied decision making because you're trying to take the results of previous research and apply them to make the best possible decision in a particular case. And there's been an issue which has kind of been quite controversial throughout this, in these fields which are looking at decision making, and that's the effectiveness of clinical versus actuarial prediction. Clinical prediction would be just the professional, the psychologist, who's working with the sex offenders, just makes an educated guess. Just based on his or her professional experience, they make an assessment about the risk. Actuarial prediction is an assessment of risk that's based on objective data, basically on static risk factors. Actuarial comes from the insurance industry. actuaries have these tables of how long people are going to live, and they figure out what rates to charge for life insurance policies and so forth. You know, do you exercise, or you know, whatever, are you a smoker? So there's been a debate about the efficacy of clinical versus actuarial prediction, and the basic result is that the actuarial models tend to do much better. You know, you give these professionals with years of clinical experience, and they perform terribly in many studies. If their predictions can only be based on their clinical intuition. And this is really a classic result in psychology going back to the 1950s, Paul Meehl. And there have been many, many studies, and this is a sort of a whole other topic for a talk. But I'll just mention this because it is relevant for sex offenders, because we've got our static risk models, which we can use to predict the likelihood of reoffending. But because we're psychologists, we want to cure them. We want to treat them. And so our clinical judgment matters. I mean, at least matters to us, matters to you if you're a psychologist working with offenders. But we've got to look at the data. We've got to sort of look really objectively, and do the data support the use of clinical information in addition to you know, static variables. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the model that's used in New Zealand, and it's known as the ASRS. And this predicts sex offender recidivism, and I think ASRS stands for Automatically Scored Risk Scale, or I've heard people, because the lead author of the article is Alex Skelton, who works for the Department of Corrections. AS means Alex Skelton's risk scale. But it's based on a scale called the Static 99, which is just basically a summation of these static risk factors that I had on the previous slide. And they dropped some of the items from the Static 99 because they weren't available on the computer database that's maintained by the Department of Corrections. So this static risk scale, there's a program that runs, and the Department of Corrections, whenever an offender is coming up, sex offender is coming up for parole, this score, this ASRS score, will get automatically generated for him. And that becomes part of the report to the parole board. And on this scale, the scores range from 0 to 9, with higher scores meaning higher levels of future risk of offending. And they're typically grouped into 4 risk categories or risk bands: low, medium high, and high. And typically what we do is we want to identify, say, medium, high, and high risk offenders. Those are the ones that have the most elevated rates of reoffending. There was a validation study that was done with the ASRS and used that same sample of offenders that were released in New Zealand in 1987. So we had 279 offenders, and based on their history, we were able to score, well, not me, but the authors of the ASRS report were able to score the ASRS, and the percentage of offenders falling into the 4 risk bands is shown here. 29% were low, 33% were medium low, and only 13% were high risk. So it's about 1 in 8, a relatively small number of offenders are identified as high risk. But those are the guys, supposedly, according to this measure, which are most likely to reoffend. So we might ask, does this hold up with the actual data? And for comparison's sake over here, I've shown the proportions of offenders that fall into the 4 low, medium, high risk bands of the Static 99. And this was a larger sample based in Canada and the UK and the United States that was used to develop the Static 99. And you can see that these percentages roughly correspond. So there's a relatively small percentage of high-risk offenders, and those are the guys that we should be most concerned about. But let's have a look at the data. Now, these graphs show what are called survival functions or survivor curves. Basically, what we've plotted are the percentage of offenders in each of the 4 risk groups who have not reoffended some period of time after they get released from prison. And the thing to notice here, these are the Static 99 data up here, and these are the New Zealand data, the ASRS. The thing to notice here is that the low-risk offenders, these are the guys on top, that curve just drops very slowly. that means that they're not reoffending at a very high rate. Whereas the high-risk guys, the high-risk group, remember they were only about 11% of the total sample, but notice that that curve drops down a lot more rapidly. That's because they're reoffending faster. So after 10 years, if we look at 10 years here on the horizontal axis, it's roughly about 55% of them have not reoffended. That means 45% of them had reoffended within 10 years. So that's a pretty high rate of sexual recidivism. We compare that to the New Zealand data, and we see the same ordering of the survivor functions by the risk level. So the low-risk offenders have the shallowest curve, so they reoffend at the lowest rate, and the high-risk offenders reoffend at the highest rate. And the moderate low and the moderate high are in the middle. So these data suggest that, well, we knew that the static 99 was a valid predictor of recidivism, but these data suggest that in New Zealand, we've got our sample of offenders, and we've come up with a model that's similar to the static 99, and it seems to perform just as well as the static 99 in terms of predicting the likelihood of future recidivism. So the ASRS, for that reason, it's standard practice for the Department of Corrections to use this measure in its classification of offenders when they're going up for release or for parole. Okay, let me just check how I'm doing time-wise. All right, okay. So I'll tell you a little bit about the Kiamarama program. And I know that there are some people in the audience that are much more knowledgeable about this than I am, and so if I say anything wrong, you can definitely chime in. This is a self-contained unit at Randolph Prison near Christchurch, and it's actually not a botanical garden, but this is this is a photo taken from the treatment building itself, and you can see. I mean, you might mistake it for sort of a nice suburban neighborhood, except for the high fences and the razor wire. But these other units over here are the housing units and where the corrections officers are. So it's basically a complex of buildings, and it's a medium security prison. So I mean, you've got all the, in order to get from one building to another, you have to be, you have to call the security, and they have to buzz you through, and so forth. Lots of the men who go through the program actually take up gardening. They have a little bit that, one of the things that they do in some of their time when they're not in treatment or doing homework problems related to treatment, they often take up gardening, and they sort of do other tasks to maintain the grounds and stuff. But this is good, actually. This is good. New Zealand should really be proud of this, because I've seen where they treat sex offenders in the United States, and you really don't want to go there. One of the nice things about Kiamarama is that it is a special treatment unit, and the corrections staff have bought in to the goals of the program. So they have to volunteer to be there. They have to want to be there. And so it just, as a psychologist, it makes it much easier to work in that kind of environment, because you're not having to, I mean, I just have sort of limited experience with this myself in the United States, but when I was doing my internship a long time ago, like, oh yeah, you're just a bleeding heart liberal, and like the officers would sort of, I mean, they were nice to me, but they definitely would sort of think, what are you doing? These guys are just bad. There's no way that you're ever going to help them out. And so I think it's actually quite important to have the corrections staff in line with the therapists and the clinicians. The other aspect of Kiamarama that's worth noting is that it runs on the principles of a therapeutic community. Now that doesn't mean like peace and love or anything like that, but it does mean that everything in the unit is structured to encourage the goals of the program. And so, for example, when an offender comes in, when he joins, maybe he's sort of he's like a novice. He doesn't have a high status position. Maybe he's got to clean the the toilets or work in the kitchen or something like that. And as he progresses in treatment and he gains experience, he can mentor guys that are coming in. And so what you try to do with designing a unit like this is to get a community going that will reinforce the pro-social goals of treatment. And that's the basic principle of a therapeutic community. And it's used in, I mean, that model has been effectively used for the treatment of for drug offenders, for violent offenders, and here it's being, of course, for sex offenders. Now, I have to say that really everyone at KM owes a lot to Steve Hudson, who was a longtime director of the clinical program and professor here. And he was a teacher and mentor for many students. And he passed away in 2001, and he was really the founder, probably did more than anybody, any other single person to really fight and lobby for the establishment of Kiamatama. And he was quite an exceptional person. So Kiamatama means let there be light. It was founded in 1989 by Steve Hudson. Bill Marshall is a Canadian-Australian clinical psychologist who's a noted theoretician and has really developed a treatment model which has been really used in many different countries around the world. And over 800 men have completed the program since the inception in '89, and Kiamatama has really served as a model for other special treatment units for the Department of Corrections. It's kind of the jewel in the crown of psychological treatment for the Department of Corrections. And there's a sister unit for sex offenders in the North Island called Tipriti, and there are now special treatment units for violent offenders that work on the same therapeutic community model at Rimataka Prison up near Wellington. So, Kiamatama, I think I've already said everything on this slide, dedicated, self-contained unit. Now, men go there in the last maybe 8 to 9 months, 6, 7, 8, 9 months of their sentence. So they would have done whatever it was, 5 years or 6 years, whatever. And then just before they're released, they would go to Kiamatama to receive treatment. And it's exclusively for men who have sexually offended against children. Kiamatama begins with an assessment phase where the man who is coming into the program has extensive interviews with psychologists and completes a psychometric test battery. So basically a series of self-report questionnaires. And he's just asked directly. I mean, they're told, look, please be honest, respond honestly. And there's also a detailed questionnaire about the history of offending and his history of relationships. Now, we also complete the battery, the psychometric assessment battery, at the end of treatment. So they do it at the beginning of treatment and then at the end of treatment. And so this is to allow us, this will be the basis for us to develop a measure of change over the course of treatment. The treatment itself lasts for 31 weeks, and it's entirely group-based. So there are groups of 8 to 9 men, 10 men, that meet for 3 times a week, 2.5-hour sessions. And non-therapy time is spent on homework assignments, prison work. And the treatment program is cognitive behavioral in orientation and consists of a series of modules. Norm building, which is the first module where the therapist that's working with the group tries to establish what are the appropriate behaviors within the group. So we want the men to be able to disclose, really shameful things. And it's hard for them to do this. I mean, some men don't. It takes them time before they will feel comfortable in the group. But part of the norm building is to encourage the men to challenge each other. If there's a man who's in denial about his offending or doesn't want to talk about something, he can be challenged by the other men in the group, not necessarily the therapist. So you try to use the group really as, norm building, the therapist is trying to set the standards, the behavioral standards for the group to encourage the disclosure and, bringing out, what happened, what were the factors that led to his offending, what are his feelings, what are, et cetera. The second module, understanding your Offending involves the construction of a detailed offense chain. So what were the steps that led to the offending in the past? And this is where, you might have heard about pedophiles who maybe start to go to a playground near the school, day after day, and they maybe notice a child, and then after a couple of weeks, maybe they wave to the child, and after a couple of weeks, they offer him a lollipop, and, that kind of sequence of events, and that culminates in the end with offending. So the goal of this module is to basically give the offender insight into what happened and what were the steps that led to his offending, and then to identify different responses or different ways of thinking or things that he could do at each step which would have prevented him from offending in the past. And this is known as relapse prevention. I've got it listed as the last module, but that's when really the core intellectual principles of the approach get reinforced. But relapse prevention treats sexual offending like a drug addiction. And what you want to do is stay sober, stay clean, if you're a sex offender and you don't want to reoffend. So you've got to know what were the factors that led to your offending. And you've got to have coping skills. You've got to have things that you can do if you're starting to feel anxious or something, and for lots of these guys, if they have some negative emotional experience, the offending is a release. So they've got to have some alternative way to cope with that stress. In any case, the rest of the modules are there. So I think I'll just skip that for now because I'd like to get into the actual research. And I might have to. Well, we'll see how it goes. But I might be a little bit behind on time, which is what I usually do. Actually, I start talking and then. Okay. So in our first study, we wanted to look at whether or not we could measure dynamic risk factors using the psychometric assessment battery that offenders completed as part of the assessment phase. And so we had some data for 495 men who completed the Chemonoma program. They were followed up after release for an average of about 6 years. About 9.9%, almost 10%, were convicted of a new sexual offense during the follow-up period, and we analyzed the data from the pretreatment battery. Now, we also had the static scores, and so the goal here is to see if we can find dynamic risk factors which predict an increased likelihood of reoffending based on the offender's self-reports, what they said during the assessment phase on the test battery. And so we had a whole range of tests that they completed during that phase. The Abel-Becker Cognition Scale, which is a measure of pro-offending attitudes. Hostility toward women scale, pretty self-explanatory. Rape myth acceptance scale. Wilson Sexual Fantasy Questionnaire, which really asks them the frequency of both sort of appropriate and deviant sexual fantasies. The Beck Depression Inventory, state trait anxiety, state trait anger. These are both measures of emotional functioning. How well are they, what levels of anxiety and anger do they have, and how well do they deal with them? How well do they manage them? Social self-esteem, assertion inventory, UCLA loneliness scale, fear of intimacy scale, and the internal-external control scale. This is a measure, what psychologists call locus of control. And does the person feel that events that happen in his life are caused by him? Does he have a sense of internal control over events in his life, or does he perceive control to be external? And that is, we think that could be a pro-offending attitude, because if the offender says, well, I have no control over my sexual urges or something like that. So that could possibly, putting the locus of control externally could possibly be a risk factor. So these were the scales that were completed by the sample. And we used a technique called factor analysis. Now this is a technical it's a statistical procedure that basically lets you boil down a large number of variables into a smaller number of what are called factors, or basically dimensions. And we found that there were 4 dimensions or factors. And you sort of do this analysis and you can figure out how many factors are there in your data, 2, 3, 4, 5. We found 4 factors. And your goal, actually, when you do this type of analysis, you look at the variables as they so-called load on the various factors or dimensions, and then you name them. So we identified 4 broad dimensions of dynamic risk: social inadequacy, sexual interests, anger, hostility, and pro-offending attitudes. And this is the result of the factor analysis. These are the factor loadings, but for instance, the sexual interests factor, you can see that this is WSFQ, that's the Wilson sexual fantasy, exploratory, intimate, impersonal, sadomasochistic. These loadings are all high, you see, for those variables. So what that's saying is that those offenders who tended to have a relatively high frequency of sexual fantasies of the exploratory character also tended to have high reported sexual fantasies for the other subscales. And so we can basically, with factor analysis, we can essentially average those together. We can aggregate them into a single factor. And so that's what we did with the other factors. So we had 20 variables, and now we only have 4. So it makes it a little bit easier to manage. And we calculated what we called overall deviance, which was just basically the sum of the factor scores, such that the higher the overall deviance score was, we found that the percentage of cases that sexually reoffended increased with the overall deviance score. So this is suggesting that this test battery is giving us a valid measure of the risk for reoffending, because the guys that are telling us with their responses that they have more, they have more sexual fantasies or more pro-offending attitudes, those guys are actually they have a higher rate of recidivism after they leave prison. So it might be counterintuitive, because you might think, I mean, aren't these guys going to be lying? I mean, they're in a treatment program, they're criminals, right? I mean, how do we know whether or not they're credible in their responses? So that's one of the important questions. But we also showed that these measures of dynamic risk also were significantly predictive of reoffending after taking into account the history, the static risk. So that's consistent with our risk prediction model, where we want to know about both static and dynamic risk. Of course, this doesn't say anything about change. This is just their risk level at the beginning of treatment. So we don't know what happens during treatment. I'm going to get to that part. I've got 10 minutes. Oh boy. I may have to skip over, just because I'm going to, well, let me just say very quickly, we looked at whether or not psychopathy and intelligence might be predictive of reoffending. And particularly, we wanted to see whether relatively low IQ or relatively high in psychopathic personality traits, as measured by what's called the PCLR. Low IQ and high psychopathic personality has been associated with offending in previous studies. And so we tested this with the Kiyamatama sample, and basically, yeah, we found that the high PCL, low IQ, so the high psychopathy, low intelligence group was more than 4 times as likely to reoffend sexually compared with any of the other groups. Now that says that there's what we would call an interaction between psychopathy and IQ on offending. So it says that if you want to be able to predict recidivism, you can't just know the psychopathic personality or the IQ by itself, but you have to know both of them, because they interact, they sort of work together, and it's the combination of high psychopathic personality and low IQ that seems to be especially predictive of reoffense risk. So I will skip over that, and I'll also briefly talk about reintegration planning. And here the question, does planning for a sex offender's return to the community after prison affect the likelihood of reoffending? And I don't know if any of you have seen the movie The Woodsman with Kevin Bacon, but he plays a sex offender who gets released from prison, and it's about basically what happens to him as he tries to rebuild his life. So it's quite a challenging movie, really. This was a leaflet that somebody posted in New Brighton, a sex offender coming to live at Britannia Street. I guess the question is, having these kinds of notices, or if we were, for instance, if we had legislation in New Zealand similar to what they have in the United States, where you have a registry for sex offenders, and that the public has to know if the sex offenders are living there, and so forth, is that going to, will that have an effect on the likelihood of reoffending? Will it make it more likely or less likely? And this is the PhD research of Gwen Willis, who's now at the University of Auckland. She's now a lecturer. And she developed a way to rate the quality of planning, like how well the offender planned for his reintegration into the community. And this is part of the Kiamarama program. They have to figure out where they're going to live, are they going to get a job, what's their social support going to be. They have to have a reintegration plan, and the Department of Corrections really puts a lot of importance on this, because if reintegration doesn't work, it's probably more likely that he's going to reoffend. So we used a matched control design where we had recidivists. We had we had offenders that we knew had reoffended, as well as a group of men who had not reoffended, but they were matched in terms of their static risk level. And then we scored the protocol. Basically, we rated how effective their planning was in the three key areas of accommodation, employment, and pro-social goals. And what we found was that overall, the recidivists had worse quality. They had, just simply looking at their plans to re-enter the community, they were worse. They had worse quality. So this suggests that poor reintegration planning by itself is a risk factor for reoffending. So we have to do what we can to help these guys get out of prison and start to get on the right track in their lives. This is a comparison of the total score, showing that the recidivists overall had poorer quality compared with the non-recidivists. So I really saved the best for last here. I've got two more bits of research, and this is where it's going to really get into the details a little bit. And this is measuring treatment change, and this is Sarah Beggs-Christofferson. Sarah Beggs, at the time that we published the research, but now she's married. She works for the Department of Corrections, and she did her PhD in 2008. And we wanted to test the convergent and predictive validity of measures of treatment change based on the self-report assessment battery and clinical rating systems. Now that's a lot of jargon, but what that means, convergent validity is, it's like if we can measure treatment change in more than one way, we should see a correspondence. Like those two independent measures of change ought to agree. So that's called convergent validity, when you have multiple measures that are correlated, that are related. Predictive validity is those guys that show more treatment change should be less likely to reoffend. So if you have predictive validity, then there's an outcome in the future, the reduced likelihood of reoffending that you expect to see that is associated with change. So this is really, in some sense, this is one of the absolutely most important questions, because as clinicians, we want to show that treatment works, and therefore that men who gain more in treatment ought to be less likely to reoffend after taking into account everything else that we know about them, right? From the moment they come into the program, we can measure their static risk, we know their history of offending, and we can measure their risk factors prior to treatment. But does the change that they show, does that add to our ability to predict reoffending? That's the statistical question that we ask. and I will just sort of cut to the chase a little bit here, and tell you that if you simply, first of all, if you simply compared their scores on the assessment battery at post-treatment with pre-treatment, so just a pre versus post, they showed massive, pretty much moderate to large gains across the board on all the measures. It was like they might have been deviant sexual offenders at the beginning of treatment, but at the end, they were little angels. Well, I mean, I'm joking a little bit, but they, in terms of their self-reports, they were very, very consistent and moderate to large gains. Now, is that credible? Were they really cured? Well, we have to interpret these change scores cautiously. You know, many of the tests were completely transparent. I mean, the hostility toward women scale. I mean, do you hate women? You know, yes, no. I mean, it's pretty basic. You know, so if you want to dissemble, if you're not being honest, or maybe they are being honest, maybe they really believe that they've changed. But they had clear incentives to show change because they were going up for parole, right? So we call this social desirability. That's a term that psychologists use to refer to like an incentive to impression management, like to try to make a good impression. These guys wanted to look good. And there are some technical problems with analysis of change scores, which I don't need to get into, but there are lots of reasons why we should be skeptical of simply seeing big change scores meaning anything. And this is a graph. Now, this is something actually I like to use in my stats class. But what this shows is the change score for the Abel-Becker. So this is the pro-offending attitude scale. So it's the magnitude of the prosocial change. So how much of a reduction in deviant attitudes did he have as a function plotted against the pre-treatment score? And what I always do is like to ask students, what do you see there? And the first thing that they see is that there's a positive relationship, right? The scores are going up from left to right. That says that the higher the level of risk at pre-treatment, the more deviant their attitudes were at pre-treatment, the higher their change score was. And if you think about that for a moment, that actually makes perfect sense, because when you calculate the change score, it's the pre-score minus the post-score. How bad you are at pre-treatment basically sets an upper limit on the size of the change score that you might get. And that's why there's this curious, if you notice there's a lot of scatter in the points down here, but up here it looks like they've almost been like sliced off with a knife or something. What's happening there, the reason for that is that all of those guys that are on that line, those were the offenders that responded like little angels at post-treatment. They had, no deviant attitudes, nothing. They had the minimum deviant score. And therefore they had the maximum change score, which was limited by how deviant their attitudes had been at pre-treatment. So we saw this pattern pretty much across the board on all the measures. Now, that says something, that says a lot actually, because there's a lot of, in technical terms, we can talk, just the fact that there's this strong relationship here means that statistically we can remove it. And then we can measure the change score after taking out, or what we call partialing out, the relationship between the change scores and recidivism. And this is something that we don't teach in the basic stats course, but in the postgraduate courses we start to get into this. But this is a standard method. And what we did was we looked at the correlations. So this is just basically how well do change scores predict reoffending. And if we just looked at the raw score, so just the pre minus post, they're all, they're not very, you don't see a lot of asterisks. That means there are not a lot of statistically significant correlations. But when we partialed out the pre-treatment scores, every single correlation shifted towards a negative direction. And many of them became significant that were not before. Now, what that means, that shifting in a negative direction, we coded recidivism as, like, if they reoffended, they got a 1, and if they didn't reoffend, they got a 0. So that means that if an offender, if treatment works, we would expect that higher change, more change, should be associated with a reduced likelihood of reoffending. So it should be a 0 rather than a 1. So what that means in terms of these numbers is that you want to see negative values over on this side. You want to see negative values. Negative values say that higher treatment predicts a reduced likelihood of reoffending. And that's exactly what we saw. But we only saw it after we statistically removed the, I'll say, variance associated with the pretreatment score. So a little bit of analysis that we had to do, but we were able unambiguously to find, boom, we have a measure of treatment change based on their self-reports, which seems to have predictive validity. Now, we did some further analyses and showed that, in fact, the gains in treatment predicted reductions in reoffending after taking into account their static and dynamic risk factors at pretreatment, which is sort of like the holy grail, really, for us, because what we want to show treatment works means that knowing everything that you know about an offender at pretreatment, if you see how he does during treatment, you should be able to adjust his risk level. And that's what these data say that we can do. So we were quite excited about that. It also suggests that treatment works because, why should these guys have if they show more gains in treatment, why should they have a reduced likelihood of reoffending unless treatment really does work? That's what we expect to see. So that was also very encouraging. Now, I think I'm just to the last bit, and I have to apologize. I'm just going to go a couple minutes over the hour, but I'm perfectly happy to stay an extra 10 minutes if you guys have more questions. But this really is the kind of where the rubber meets the road, the question of whether treatment really works. So does psychological treatment for sex offenders work? Now, this is obviously a very important question. It's controversial for all sorts of reasons. There have been a number of what are called meta-analyses that have been conducted by researchers. And what these meta-analyses are is just basically taking all the studies that have been published and kind of averaging them together to find out overall, is there a reduction in reoffending associated with treatment. And these meta-analyses, they always find a significant effect. Yeah, treatment works. But the other side of the coin, or the critics of those studies, say that the individual studies that go into these meta-analyses are flawed. They've got all sorts of problems. They don't have adequate control groups. They don't use randomized, blah, blah, blah. We could talk about this for hours. So it's like the researchers are going back and forth. But overall, there seems to be a reduction in reoffending, but the studies themselves can be criticized. Now, so we decided to have a look at whether treatment works at Kemotima. And this was Lucy Morse, who, in fact, is, if she could say hello, stellar master's student last year and current PhD student. And we had data from the Department of Corrections for basically every sexual offender who was imprisoned and then released in New Zealand, but did not go to Kemotima or another special treatment unit. And we wanted to compare the rates of offending, the rates of reoffending for the Kemotima, the men who went through the Kemotima program, with men who had similar crimes but did not attend KM. And so what we did, we obtained the offense histories for offenders who attended Kemotima and were released after 1st of January 1997. So with the scope of our study, we were able to go up until the end of 2008. So that's 428 men. And then we had what we hoped would be our control group of men who were convicted of sexual offenses against children who did not attend Kemotima or the TPDT sister program in Auckland, and were also released, in this case, after 1st of January 1998. And there was almost 2,000 of those in that sample. And the average follow-up time was 6 years, and we measured recidivism as just being charged. And we used charge rather than a conviction because the data were recent. So if we had men who had been charged but their court case was pending, because some of them had pretty short follow-up times, we decided to use charge. And so what we found, now this graph shows the overall rates of recidivism for general recidivism. So for general recidivism, the untreated group had a significantly higher rate of reoffending. Now that's for general offenses, so that's like driving offenses or something, we're not really very concerned about this, but it's nice to see that the treated group has a lower rate of reoffending. The stars mean that it's a statistically significant reduction. They also had a significantly lower rate of violent recidivism, the treated compared with the untreated. But for sexual recidivism, both are pretty much spot on 7%. So, I mean, on the one hand, that's great. Remember what I showed you before at the beginning, that in the 1987 data in New Zealand, for that cohort, the sexual recidivism rate was 27.6%. And now, for offenders that have been released really in the last 15 years, we're talking about a 7.4% recidivism rate. So that's pretty dramatic. So that's good news. But it, perhaps it creates a problem. I mean, can we say that treatment is really working if the untreated offenders are reoffending at the same rate as the men who go through the treatment program? So what could be going on here? Well, whenever you're doing a research study like this, you have to first ask yourself if the groups that you're comparing are like apples and apples. So we would say that that's a homogeneous comparison, if you can compare apples with apples. So what we did was look at the static risk, the ASRS items for each of the groups, for the treated and the untreated. And what we found was that overall, the treated offenders had a significantly higher level of static risk. But it wasn't just that they had an overall level of higher risk, it depended on the items. So they had many more prior sex offenses. They were also more likely to have more prior sentencing dates, more likely to have prior non-contact offenses. But they were less likely to have prior violent offenses, more likely to have male victims, and less likely to be a young offender. So what this says is that these two groups, the treated and the untreated offender groups, are not the same. Treated offenders basically tended to be older, have more prior sex offenses, male victims, sort of more severe sexual offending, and a longer sentence duration. I mean, it makes perfect sense why they would be the treated group. A lot of the untreated group, they were in there for sex crimes, but if they're young and it's their first offense or whatever, they might get a they might get a relatively short sentence. They might not have the opportunity even to go to Kiamatama. So we need to have some way of taking this into account, this heterogeneity between our groups. And statistically, there are ways of doing this. And Lucy worked on this for her master's thesis. We also found that the predictive validities of the different risk factors were different for the untreated and treated groups. That is, the risk factors sort of didn't have the same predictive relationships with reoffending. So that is like another spanner that you throw in the works. And so what we had to do at the end of the day was equally weight the treated and the untreated groups when we were making the comparison. And this is basically a way of equalizing the sample sizes, because we had relatively few men in the Kiamatama group and lots of untreated offenders. We needed to equally weight those two groups in the when we did the analysis. And so we used a technical procedure called stepwise logistic regression to try to come up with the best model to predict reoffending using all of the static risk factors. So this is like setting the ASRS aside, just using the data. How well can we predict reoffending? And then once we've done that, then to test, if we then, with our best model, we add to that group status, like that is knowing whether or not they were treated or untreated, does that significantly improve our ability to predict reoffending? And if so, in what direction? And so what we found was, well, this just basically shows the model that we had at step 1 and then at step 2. And the critical thing down here is group. And this is minus 0.348. And that is a significant value. So what that's saying is that the group did, in fact, significantly improve the the prediction of the model. And the fact that that's negative means that the Kemonoma group was less likely to reoffend after taking into account their risk factors that were included in the model at step 1. Now that might seem like a lot of, perhaps it seems like some statistical hocus pocus a little bit, but we're struggling, Lucy and I were working on this, and we're struggling to try to find a way to compare apples and oranges. And this was the best approach that we found. And we feel this is the fairest way to analyze these data. What the data mean is that there is a reduction of basically 0.706 in the odds of recidivism. Now, translating that into something that maybe is a little bit easier to sort of take away, the results suggest that if the men had not received treatment, that the recidivism rate would have been 10% instead of 7.2%. That's what the results of our analysis say. Now, we had 32 of the 428 guys that were treated reoffend. In the absence of treatment, the model says that 43 of them would have reoffended. So that's the reduction of 10% to 7.2%. It's a reduction of 30% in the rate, but you can see that the rates are already pretty low. So 10% down to 7.2%. So 11 sexual offenses, in theory, according to this analysis, were prevented by the men going through treatment. And there's a measure known as the number necessary to treat, which you sometimes see in clinical results. And that's the number of, basically, cases that you have to treat in order to get one positive result. So one offender, well, one would-be offender who becomes a non-offender. And so that's 39 in this case. Right, so that's a lot of, I realize, a lot of stuff that we've gone through, but I think it really does paint a positive picture at the end of the day. The research that's been done at Kemonoma, I think New Zealand really can be proud of it, and it's shown that we can measure dynamic risk factors, that we can measure treatment change using offender self-reports. And that's kind of surprising, really, in some respects, but the data suggests that once we take into account the overall bias towards looking good, showing that they've changed, once we control for that, we get measures of treatment gain which predict reductions in recidivism. And I didn't have a chance to say this, but which also agree with other measures of treatment change based on clinical rating systems. Planning for reintegration is important. Evaluation of effectiveness of treatment program efficacy is hard. We can't really do, like in medicine, you can do like a placebo design, a randomized double-blind placebo. We can't do that here. I mean, that's one of the problems. It's very, very hard to get a good research design. And so we have to do the best we can. But the analysis says that with the most recent data, and if I went back to the data from Kemonoma in the early 90s, we would have even a better effect. There would be more of a reduction in recidivism compared with the untreateds. But overall, the rates of recidivism were higher than they are. So we wanted to look at the most recent data. But the best analysis suggests that Kemonoma reduces recidivism by about 30%. But remember that those base rates are pretty low. We're talking about 7%, 7 to 10% sexual recidivism. But I'd say that the bottom line really strongly suggests that psychological treatment for sexual offenders works. So thanks to everybody there and staff at Kemonoma, Department of Corrections and Police. And